Billions of dollars spent and not really a single thing to actually show for it. Yes, my friends, that is the story summed up quite neatly of the California high-speed rail project, something that is being lambasted as perhaps the greatest scam, or at least infrastructure failure, in US history. And honestly, I'm serious when I say that it's not recent or surprising news. In 2015, it topped the Houston Chronicle's John Boyd's list of America's 20 biggest wastes of money ever at $68 billion. That was just a little over double what the initial price point was of $33 billion that California politicians had promised that it would cost when they asked voters to approve it back in 2008. Now, as it is like what? Not 16, 17? No, 18 years later. Yeah, 18 years later here at this point. We're looking at something that is more along the lines of $120 to $130 billion in total expected costs. Many billions having already been paid, and worse yet, despite literally decades of work on the project, not a single piece of track had ever been laid until at the time that I'm actually writing this, or now filming here, I guess, in mid-February of 2026, just the past couple of weeks. Yeah, for those of you who've been citing the statistic before about not a single piece of track ever being laid, that now technically speaking, is no longer true. It just doesn't really make the situation all that much better. On February 3rd of this year, 2026, California Governor Gavin Newsom, alongside state and community leaders, would celebrate the completion of the California High-Speed Rail Authority's Southern Railhead facility in Kern County. With track installation now apparently complete at the 150-acre site near Wasco, the facility is supposed to operate as a central logistics hub for delivery, storage, and deployment of critical materials that are needed to electrify and operate the system. Now, whether or not it actually will do that, though, seems to be more of a matter of dumping unlimited funding and throwing that all into a black hole for who knows how long at this point, but that black hole also has a chance to swallow any form of scrutiny that is dedicated to it. Or at least that is what critics of the new California state legislature bill say is going to happen. What I mean by that is that at the time that I am making this in mid-February of 2026, a proposed bill, and again, I need to stress, this is proposed, not actually set to pass, Assembly Bill 1608 would bar the California Inspector General from releasing what legislation describes as project weaknesses, including security risks, fraud detection controls, and pending lawsuits. A move that supporters say would protect sensitive records, but critics argue that it would limit transparency, allowing for even more fraud to slip through the cracks than what has already potentially occurred. And that right there is something that I also really need to stress. Everything that we are talking about here is potential fraud, not necessarily guaranteed. Whether the ballooned costs have come from said fraud, just incompetence, wishful thinking, or other complications is yet to be fully determined, but this has been a political crapshoot from start to, well, not exactly finish. Like it's clearly not done and will not potentially be done for decades if it ever actually will be at all. But the question here, as always here, my friends, on the history of everything is how exactly did we get here? And from that, what is going to happen next? Well, in order to answer that, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to when even this non-existent $100 billion rail system was nothing more than an idea. A position that, honestly, if I'm going to be honest here, it has not moved all that far from to today, but holy crap, like you all probably see from the very beginning, looking at the size of this thing, this is going to take a long time to explain. This is likely the longest, most in-depth video I have ever done on any topic ever on this channel. And it took me over a week's worth of work in order to try and even put this together to film in the first place. So, if you could do me a favor and like the video or comment something in the algorithm to just help it along, I would really appreciate it, as it can actually make the investment worth it. Actually, that right there about investment being worth it is a phrase that probably many Californians have said over the last decade, but have been disappointed. Either way, we need to focus on the actual rail and the video itself. To begin, my friends. Oh, hi. Every time I'm filming, really. I swear to God, every single time I'm trying to cover any topic whatsoever, all that you ever want is attention. Really. Every time. Every time. On the last video that I did, I swear, half the comments of that video were literally just about this cat. This is Moonbeam, for anyone who is curious. Yeah, this is my cat. And she's a little fat attention hog. Yes, I know you like that.
But my friends, before it is that we continue with today's story, I would just like to thank today's sponsor, Aura. Which is very important, mind you, because I'm sure that for any of you who are watching this right now, any denizens of the internet, you're probably wondering, why the heck is it that I keep on getting flooded with spam calls and emails and things like that? And the answer is because your information is being sold by data brokers out there online. That is why I recommend today's sponsor, Aura, to my friends, followers, and family, because they actually take care of the hard part, automatically removing your info from these sites and keeping it off. Because the thing is, Aura is so much more than just a digital security service. You get alerts if your personal info is found on the dark web, you get real-time fraud alerts for credit and banking, 24/7 monitoring to help keep your identity secure, a secure VPN, antivirus, password manager, and more, as well as US-based support available around the clock if something goes wrong. If something does go wrong somehow, you have up to $5 million in identity theft protection from Aura. So yeah, you're kind of covered. Seriously, there are so many bad actors out there on the internet, and considering how many people I have had that have made threats against me, my friends, my family, and more because of what it is that I do, I cannot let myself be vulnerable, and honestly, you should not either. Make sure to go to my link down in the description and try Aura for free for 14 days. Go to aura.com/history-of-everything, and just by trying it out, you can see for the first 14 days whether or not your data is out there on the internet. Please be safe, my friends. If there is anything that we have shown, the world is a dangerous and very complex place.
Anyway, to begin, we need to talk about first what high-speed rail is and what the California rail system was actually supposed to be. High-speed rail, or HSR, is a passenger train system that generally travels at least 200 kilometers or 124 miles per hour, and can cruise up to 355 kilometers or 221 miles per hour, though some have reached even higher speeds. More than 20 countries, largely in Asia and Europe, have high-speed rail networks, and this is a very big deal for them. It's something that is very famous. The United States, on the other hand, has arguably one of the worst passenger rail systems in the world. Excluding the Acela route, Amtrak trains are infrequent, they are expensive, and they are more prone to delay than their European and East Asian counterparts. There are some things that have been done in order to improve them, especially in the last couple of years, and we've seen a whole bunch of things with like Brightline down in Florida. But that all being said, in rankings of high-speed rail network length, the United States falls at 11th, just behind Sweden, which has a population roughly the same size as North Carolina's. So, not necessarily very impressive. China, on the other hand, which had no high-speed rail at all at the start of the 21st century, aggressively built up these railways and now leads the world in this mode of transportation. With a network of lines covering roughly 38,000 kilometers or 24,000 miles, high-speed rail connects all of the country's major megacity clusters. Not only is this impressive, but China even plans to expand its high-speed railway network to nearly 70,000 kilometers or 43,000 miles by the year 2035. And honestly, when talking about rivalries, this has been a sore spot for many in the United States. But the question then is, what exactly has the United States done regarding rail? Well, quite frankly, the simple answer to that is that the United States focused more resources on highways than on trains. And when I say that, this is not a video on the American highway system and its benefits or demerits, nor is it an opinion piece to advocate for policy change or anything like that. I do not make opinion pieces. I do not tell people what it is that they should think. That is not my place. No, this is simply stating the fact that the US, which is much more spread out, population-wise, in comparison to the much denser regions of Asia and Europe, it focused more on highways and cars versus trains. To that end, regarding rail, America has struggled to develop high-speed rail on a widespread basis, despite taking steps even dating back to the 1960s to do so. In 1965, Congress would even go and pass the High-Speed Ground Transportation Act, which aimed at developing and demonstrating high-speed ground technologies. The initiative largely fell flat, however. Turbo trains would operate in the 1970s between Boston and New York City, but these were then abandoned. French-designed models were still operating in New York State around the mid-1980s, but those also were discontinued. As it is now, and I already mentioned here once before, America only has a single high-speed rail line, the Acela in the Northeast, between Boston and Washington, D.C. The Acela travels at speeds up to 241 kilometers or 150 miles per hour in some sections, so sure, it does, technically speaking, count as high-speed rail. But the corridor has structural challenges that keep trains from moving at that speed throughout the entire route. Those include curves, which slow down trains, some bridges and tunnels that are more than 100 years old, which that should worry you if you saw my American infrastructure video a while back. And along with that, having to share the tracks with other trains, including freight, that obviously move at much slower speeds. Amtrak's goal is to shorten the Acela's trip between New York and Washington to less than 2 hours, but we will have to wait and see what will actually happen on the East Coast eventually. This video, though, this is dedicated to the West Coast and California, the largest state population-wise in the United States at 39 million people, third in terms of size at 163,000 square miles or 424,000 square kilometers, and number one in GDP at $4.1 trillion, making it larger, more populous, and far richer than many other countries on Earth. Not just the states in the United States, but countries on Earth by itself. In fact, if California was a country, it would be like the fourth or fifth wealthiest country on Earth. Which, yes, that does sound very impressive, but underneath those glamorous numbers are some serious complications and issues, like severe long-term housing and homeless crises, extreme income inequality, high costs of living, climate risks like devastating wildfires, drought, water management issues, alongside a strained electrical grid and population decline. There are a lot of problems, but this video is not about California's overall problems. We need to focus more on the rail issue. Though, that being said, if you want me to do a full video on California in general, like this video and let me know in the comment section down below. Also, my friends, slight interjection on this. I know this entire episode is dedicated to literally a travel system, but if you actually want to travel with me, I am leading a series of group trips this year, and at the time that I'm making this, there are still several spots that are available for Croatia and Greece, which we're going to be going to this summer. So if you're looking to actually go on an adventure with me, learn history, and do a lot more stuff, you can find the links to that down in my description. All you really have to do is put 25% down on the trip, and then there are payment plan options, and each one of these has been an absolute blast. So if you actually want to meet in person and you want to talk about varying different things, well, this is your opportunity, and then we can potentially go drinking in Europe. It'll be a fun time. Wine at Diocletian's Palace, exactly what we want. Anyway, just wanted to put that in here. It's going to be an absolute blast, sorry. Anyway, the idea of a high-speed rail line connecting major cities of California is something that dates back decades. But it began to take concrete institutional form in 1996 when the California State Legislature would create the California High-Speed Rail Authority, the CHSRA. This authority was charged with planning and eventually building a system of bullet trains that would link San Francisco, Los Angeles, Sacramento, and San Diego through a network of high-speed corridors. At the time that all this was taking place, California was experiencing explosive population growth. Its highways and airports were increasingly congested, and the state's political culture was broadly amenable to large public infrastructure investments. The initial concept was modeled on a proven high-speed rail system, that of Japan, France, Germany, which of course had demonstrated that trains traveling at 180 to 220 miles per hour could compete with or even outperform air travel for city pair distances in the 300 to 500 mile range, which, coincidentally enough, is exactly the distance between San Francisco and Los Angeles. It really seemed to be a perfect idea, but the first problem here was arguably with the agency that was set up in the first place to do the project. What I mean by this is that the CHSRA was brand spanking new. It had never existed before, and it lacked experience managing so big a project and navigating complex bureaucracies. Without that experience, the authority's 10 initial employees, which seems extremely small, but yes, 10, relied heavily on consultants, things like what eventually would be the engineering firm WSP, William Sale Partnership, based out of the UK, which, when you rely on consultants, that drastically runs up expenses and immediately makes things a bit of a problem. Just to give you an idea of what it is that I am talking about here, Lou Thompson, who chaired the High Speed Rail Peer Review Group, which was established in 2008 to provide project oversight, from 2012 until 2024 would say that, and I quote, "We paid WSP and their predecessor more than $800 million in consulting fees," end quote. That is right, Almost $1 billion alone was paid here in just consultancy fees. This would be one of the continuous costs of the project, and due to funding issues and outcry, gradually with time the percentage of consultant workers was reduced over time. Either way though, throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, going back to the beginning, the authority conducted feasibility studies, environmental reviews, and route analyses. Several major routing decisions were debated during this period, including whether the line from Central Valley to San Francisco Bay Area should pass through the Altamont Pass, which would have served the rapidly growing cities of the Eastern Bay Area and connected to existing BART infrastructure, this being the Bay Area Rapid Transport System, or to send things through Pacheco Pass, which would route them through the much less populated Gilroy area, but that would more directly serve San Jose. The authority ultimately chose the Pacheco Pass alignment, which is a decision that remains deeply controversial to this day because it added engineering complexity, it increased costs, and it served far fewer riders. But it was favored by San Jose area politicians and Silicon Valley, who wanted their city on the main line. This was an early sign that political considerations would repeatedly override engineering and ridership logic throughout the project's history, and that is going to be a constant theme as you're going to see from this. The authority also had to choose how the line would enter the Los Angeles basin from the Central Valley. The Tehachapi Mountains would present an enormous engineering challenge. The existing rail line through the Tehachapis is one of the most famous and difficult mountain railroad crossings in the entire world, and building a high-speed route through this terrain would require extensive tunneling, which of course is going to cost a buttload of money. Despite these known challenges, the authority still pressed forward with planning, and by the mid-2000s it was preparing to ask California voters to authorize bond funding for the project under Proposition 1A. And it is here, my friends, that things really begin in earnest, and it sets the stage for all the problems that you would see afterwards. The campaign for Proposition 1A was massive and approached with both a sense of optimism for the future and also a sense of urgency that this was something that absolutely had to be done. Supporters framed the project as a transformative investment, something that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, create hundreds of thousands of jobs, reduce dependence on oil, which, mind you, for anyone who knows, it's very expensive in California, by the way, and it would ease highway and airport congestion, and from that, position California as a leader in 21st century transportation. Environmental groups, labor unions, construction companies, and many politicians from both parties endorsed the measure, giving it political legitimacy, and the best part was the cost and time. The campaign materials emphasized the total cost of the project would only be around $33 billion, and it would be complete by the year 2020. Now, this may sound expensive, and yes, $33 billion is absolutely a lot of money, but in terms of mega projects, that is not really necessarily all that bad. I will be doing more videos on other mega project disasters here soon, as we have to talk about Saudi Arabia again, but either way, I digress. What was not emphasized from the proposition, and what many insiders likely already knew, was that these figures were almost entirely, completely unrealistic. They were fantasies. International experience with high-speed rail construction, even in countries with far lower labor costs and more streamlined regulatory environments than the United States, suggested that a project of this scope would cost a lot more money, and that is without anything going wrong. The $33 billion estimate assumed that everything was going to go smoothly, perfectly even, that land acquisition would proceed without any major delays, that construction costs would not escalate, that the environmental litigation would not stall the project, and that federal and private funding would materialize as hoped. These were optimistic assumptions bordering on outright fantasy, but that didn't matter yet necessarily, as the bill had not even passed. Yet. Eventually, though, people would have to face reality. In November of 2008, California voters went to the polls to decide on Proposition 1A, the Safe, Reliable, High-Speed Passenger Train Bond Act for the 21st century. The measure asked voters to authorize $9.95 billion in general obligation bonds to partially fund the construction of a high-speed rail system. The proposition was accompanied by a detailed set of promises and legal requirements that were written into the bond language itself. And this is what I mentioned here just a moment ago. Voters were told that the total project cost would be approximately $33 billion. They were told the train would travel from San Francisco to Los Angeles Union Station in 2 hours and 40 minutes or less. They were told the system would be operational by 2020. They were told the system would not require any operating subsidies. That is, once built, the train would generate enough fare revenue to actually cover their own operating costs and not need taxpayer money. And they were told that a significant portion of the construction funding would come from private investment and federal grants, meaning the state bonds, that was only supposed to be a down payment. In the end, the measure would pass with approximately 52.7% of the vote, which, yeah, that was enough to get it passed, but it wasn't necessarily an overwhelming mandate. And largely it seems to have passed because of the specific fiscal promises that were embedded in the proposition itself, which many analysts would call quite charitably extreme optimism. Alongside that, the 2020 completion date was arguably fantasy, given that not even a single inch of the route had been environmentally cleared yet for construction, and the authority did not even have finalized engineering designs. Like, oh my god, like from the very start, when all this is going down, holy crap, all they had was a piece of paper. And on this paper was not even all the information, like it was not fully filled out. But as it is, these were the numbers presented to voters, and the voters approved them. So now something was going to happen one way or another. Or nothing was going to happen, really, I guess, because honestly, I can make that joke here again and again over the course of this video. That's just what would end up happening with not a single piece of track being laid for 18 years. Either way, my friends, the timing of the vote in November of 2008 had a much greater effect than anyone initially realized. And the reason for that is because it coincided with the rise of President Barack Obama. To explain what it is that I mean, Obama had campaigned on a platform of massive infrastructure investment as a way to stimulate the economy during the Great Recession. And so, when his administration passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in February of 2009, it would include $8 billion for high-speed rail projects nationwide. California, with its voter-approved bond measure and its ambitious plans that had already started, was by far the most prominent applicant for these funds. In January of 2010, the federal government would award California $2.25 billion for the high-speed rail project, and additional grants over the following year would bring the total federal commitment to approximately $3.5 billion. California's share was boosted significantly by the fact that several other states had actually turned down their federal high-speed rail allocations. Florida Governor Rick Scott, as an example, rejected $2.4 billion for a Tampa to Orlando line, and the governors of Ohio and Wisconsin similarly rejected funds that were earmarked for rail projects in their states, viewing them as wasteful fantasies that would saddle their states with future costs and not much to show for it. Which, if you consider what was going down in California, yeah? We'll get to that. As a result, much of this rejected money was instead redirected to California, which was eager to absorb it. It really did seem to be the perfect situation. But, my friends, as we all know, there's never really any such thing as perfect. And if something seems to be too good to be true, well, it probably is. The federal funding was a major boost, yes, but it also came with strings that would have profound consequences. The grants had strict deadlines for expenditure. The money had to be committed and spent within defined timeframes, or it would be forfeited and potentially clawed back by the state. This created enormous pressure on the California High-Speed Rail Authority to begin construction as quickly as possible, regardless of whether or not the project was actually ready or not. Environmental clearances were still incomplete for most of the route, land acquisition had barely even started, and engineering designs were in many cases still preliminary. But the clock was ticking on quite literally billions of dollars in federal money, and the authority could not afford, quite literally, to let any of that slip away. This pressure would lead directly to what many consider the greatest, most consequential and damaging decision in the entire project's history: the decision to begin construction in the Central Valley itself. The authority announced that the first construction segment would run through the flat agricultural heartland of California, roughly from Madera to Fresno initially, with the segment eventually extending from Merced in the north to Bakersfield in the south. The rationale for this choice was primarily logistical and political. The Central Valley offered the easiest construction conditions anywhere on the route. The terrain was flat, eliminating the need for expensive tunneling or mountain engineering. The land was relatively cheap compared to the Bay Area or Los Angeles basin. There were fewer dense urban areas to navigate, which simplified right-of-way acquisition and reduced the potential for community opposition. Really, there is a strong kind of logic to it, and in comparison to the mountain crossings at Tehachapi and Pacheco, these were years away from having completed environmental reviews and engineering designs. The urban settlements in the Bay Area and Los Angeles basin would require navigating extraordinarily complex and expensive land acquisition in some of what, again, is the most valuable real estate market, or one of the most valuable real estate markets in the entire world, dealing with dense existing infrastructure and managing the political opposition of wealthy, well-connected communities that did not want a rail line disrupting their neighborhoods. Really, they went with the easy option. Central Valley politicians, on the other hand, in comparison to that, particularly those that were representing Fresno and other surrounding agricultural communities, they were huge supporters of this, who saw the project as a massive economic development opportunity for a region that had long time suffered from high unemployment, poverty, and a sense of being neglected by the state government, which chose to focus more of its attention on its coastal cities. And this political and economic dynamic that we're describing here is something that we really need to address here for you to understand why all of this was such a big deal and why it was both a good thing for some and a giant mistake for others. See, when we're talking about the Central Valley, this is a region that historically had been represented by a mix of more conservative Democrats and Republicans who focused on agricultural water policy, immigration, economic development, these kinds of things, rather than the grander social projects that you would see in more metropolitan areas. The high-speed rail project would offer something that almost never came to the Central Valley: billions of dollars in direct federal and state investment, thousands of construction jobs, and the promise that the region would become a connected part of the state's economic mainstream rather than a flyover zone between San Francisco and Los Angeles. In fact, Fresno Mayor Ashley Swearengin, a Republican, would initially express cautious support for the project, seeing it as a potential catalyst for downtown development. State legislators from the region would lobby hard to ensure that the Central Valley would be the starting point for construction. And this political support was crucial because it gave the authority a path of least resistance at a time when it desperately needed to show progress quickly. Which is good, okay? That is something that is good for them. But the decision also meant that the authority was building the part of the system that had the least standalone value, creating a segment that critics would mercilessly, and I hate to say it, accurately ridicule as a train to nowhere. Which of course calls to mind those moments that we have talked about here with China's Belt and Road Initiative with its bridges, trains, and roads to nowhere that do not serve a real purpose other than to build a thing. And I'm going to need to explain this here. The train to nowhere label deserves some serious unpacking because it exemplifies one of the fundamental strategic problems and errors of the entire project. When you build a high-speed rail system, the order in which you construct the segments matter enormously for political and financial sustainability. If you build the most useful segment first, like, a connection between two major cities that immediately attracts riders and generates revenue, well, you have created a proof of concept that builds public support, it generates income, and it makes the case for continued investment. That is how most successful international high-speed rail systems were built. France's TGV system began with the Paris to Lyon line, connecting the country's two largest cities and immediately demonstrating that high-speed rail could compete with air travel. Japan's Shinkansen began with the Tokyo-Osaka line, connecting the country's two largest metropolitan areas with a combined population in 1964 of around 13 to 14 million people. That was a big deal. These initial segments were immediately useful, immediately profitable, and immediately popular, creating momentum for system expansion. California, on the other hand, did the exact opposite. By building the Central Valley first, it created a segment that connected Merced and Bakersfield, two cities that had a combined metropolitan population of around 800 to 900,000 people, between which there was essentially no significant travel demand that would justify 220 mile per hour rail service. Even when completed, this segment could not demonstrate what high-speed rail could do for California because it would not connect to any of the places where people actually needed to travel. It would instead just be a showcase of engineering capability sitting in the middle of farmland, carrying few, if any, passengers and generating basically no revenue, serving primarily as evidence for critics who argued that the entire project was a massive waste of money. Now, of course, the authority understood this criticism, and they did try to address it by arguing that the Central Valley segment was the backbone of the system, the foundational spine to which the urban extensions would later be attached. They pointed out that every rail system has to start somewhere, and that building the easiest part first was a logical construction sequence. They also argued that the Central Valley segment would eventually be the highest speed portion of the system, where trains could reach the maximum 220 mph speeds on long straight stretches through flat terrain, and this would provide the time savings that made the overall San Francisco to Los Angeles travel time more competitive. Now, these arguments were technically valid, but politically and strategically completely tone deaf. The public does not evaluate infrastructure projects based on construction sequence logic. The public evaluates them based on whether or not they can actually see and use the results of their tax dollars, and a high-speed rail line through Central Valley with no connections to any major cities was something that no real member of the public could use for anything. Worse yet, this was still very early on in the project, and some changes to earlier promises were already becoming quite obvious. In the year 2011, the authority would go and release an updated business plan that had revised the total project cost upwards to $43 billion, a 30% increase from the figure that voters had approved literally just 3 years prior, and it was already going up by that much. Then, in 2012, a revised plan would again put the cost at approximately $68 billion, more than double the Proposition 1A estimate. This was a political bombshell. Public support for the project, which had never necessarily been overwhelming, but it was still in the positive, began to collapse significantly. Polls showed that if a vote were held again with the updated cost figures, Prop 1A would likely fail. Lawsuits were filed arguing the project no longer complied with the terms of Proposition 1A, and so the bonds should not be able to be sold anymore. And a judge initially ruled that the authority had not adequately demonstrated compliance with the Bond Act's requirements. But this ruling was later overturned on appeal, with the courts generally deferring to the authority's discretion. So yeah, we are definitely not off to a great start, but there was still a large amount of political will and capital thanks to the efforts of the governor of California at the time, Jerry Brown. Now, to explain this, Governor Jerry Brown, who took office in January of 2011, became the project's most powerful and determined political champion. Brown was a singular figure in California politics, a former governor from the 1970s who had returned to office decades later and was known for his environmentalism and willingness to undertake massive, ambitious, long-term projects. For Brown, high-speed rail was not just a simple transportation project. No, this was a moral and environmental imperative. It had to be done. He saw it as California's contribution to fighting climate change, as a way to reshape the state's growth patterns away from suburban sprawl and towards denser transit-oriented development, the major cities you would see in Europe or Asia, and as a statement that California could still build big things. He was willing to deploy significant political capital to keep the project alive during moments when it seemed on the verge of collapse, and that is something that helped to really keep it going. Brown's approach was to frame the project in almost philosophical terms, you could say. He would oftentimes compare it to great infrastructure achievements of the past, like the aqueducts of his own father, Pat Brown, who had built them as governor, the interstate highway system, the transcontinental railroad, things like that. He dismissed critics as naysayers who lacked vision to do anything important. And this framing was effective in rallying Democrat support in the legislature and among environmental groups. But it also meant that the project became increasingly tied to Brown personally. When the costs continued to rise and timelines continued to slip and delays continued to be experienced, the project's failures became his failures in the eyes of his opponents. During the Brown years, the authority made some strategic adjustments to try and regain credibility. They would embrace what was called a blended approach in 2012 in the urban areas, particularly in the San Francisco Bay Area and Southern California. Instead of building dedicated high-speed rail tracks all the way into downtown San Francisco and Los Angeles, the plan was instead modified to have high-speed trains share existing tracks with commuter rail systems for the final miles. This would reduce costs and complexity, yes, but it would also mean that trains would not be able to achieve the 220 mile per hour speeds in these urban segments, potentially making the time longer than the 2 hour and 40 minutes that had been promised in Prop 1A. The blended approach was another point of contention, with critics arguing that it violated the terms of the bond measure and that the whole thing should just be scrapped. But no, it would continue. And the authority also began to emphasize the project's role in improving regional rail, arguing that even if the full high-speed system was delayed, the investments that were being made in the local rail would upgrade and electrify existing commuter rail corridors, providing benefits in the near term. This was a pragmatic adaptation. Yes, it was something that could work, but also at the same time, ideologically, it was a crack. It was an admission that the original vision was simply not achievable on the original timeline or budget, which by this point in 2012 was already obvious with the fact that it was up to $68 billion, over double. Still, things would have to move forward as long as Brown was in charge. Construction itself in the Central Valley would officially begin in January of 2015 with a groundbreaking ceremony in Fresno. Governor Jerry Brown would preside over the event, and it was framed as a historic moment, the beginning of America's first true high-speed rail system. But the reality on the ground was in fact far messier than the ceremonial rhetoric that was being suggested. The authority had awarded the initial construction contract to a joint venture led by Tudor Perini, one of the largest construction firms in the entire United States, along with Zachary Construction and Parsons Corporation. The contract would cover roughly 29 miles of the initial construction segment in the Fresno area. Almost immediately, the project ran into problems that would persist and multiply for years after this point. See, the land acquisition process proved far more difficult and time-consuming than the authority had anticipated. And this failure deserves detailed examinations because it really does show the gap between the authority's planning assumptions, where they thought, everything is going to go absolutely fine, and the reality of building infrastructure in the United States, which can be done, yes, and it can be done quite well, but it can also be a very painful process, especially in places like California. To construct the rail line, the authority needed to acquire full or partial ownership of thousands of individual parcels of land along the route. And in many cases, this meant purchasing the farmland from families who had owned and worked the land for generations. In other cases, it meant acquiring commercial properties, relocating businesses, and reconfiguring local road and utility corridors. The authority had legal power to use eminent domain, which is the government's ability to force the sale of private property for public use. But eminent domain proceedings in California are very complex, they are very expensive, and they are very time-consuming. Property owners have the right to challenge the government's valuation of their land, to argue that the taking is not for a legitimate public purpose, and to demand compensation not just for the land itself, but for the lost business income, relocation costs, and other damages. Which, of course, are things that all help to protect people from government overreach, yes. But many Central Valley landowners fought the acquisitions aggressively. Some were ideologically opposed to the project and saw the government's attempt to take their land as an infringement upon their property rights. Others were willing to sell, but they believed the authority was offering far less than their land was worth. Still, others had complex ownership situations, properties that were held in trusts, properties with multiple owners who disagreed about whether to sell, properties with agricultural leases that had to be resolved. Some properties had environmental contamination that had to be assessed and remediated before construction could ever proceed. The authority's land acquisition team was severely understaffed and overwhelmed, and the process would fall months, and then after that, years behind schedule. By the time construction was supposed to be well underway, the authority still did not have clear title to many of the parcels that it needed in the first place. This meant that construction crews would be ready to work on a particular stretch of the route, but they could not proceed because the land had not been acquired yet. The contractors would then have to shift their work to other areas, which would create very inefficient and fragmented construction patterns that would drive up costs. You'd have to go to one area in the beginning, then a month later you were over in another part, then you had to leave there to go to another part in the middle, then you had to go to another part after that, and it just kept on shifting job sites. And this highly inefficient, Fragmented construction would just drive up costs insanely high. And that was going to prove to be especially painful. See, the relationship between the authority and its lead contractor, the Tudor Perini Zachary Parsons joint venture thing that we mentioned here before, that deteriorated steadily as these problems mounted. The contractors argued that the authority's failure to deliver cleared right-of-way on schedule would constitute a breach of the contract and entitled them to additional compensation for idle equipment, remobilization costs, and schedule delays. The authority would counter that the contractors were inflating their claims and that some of the delays were due to the contractors' own performance problems. This dispute would escalate into formal claims and counterclaims worth, and I'm not even kidding from this, hundreds of millions of dollars. The pattern was depressingly familiar with other troubled American megaprojects. The government agency lacked the internal expertise and staffing to effectively manage the contractor. The contractor would exploit every contractual mechanism to maximize its compensation, and the resulting adversarial relationship would make both parties far less efficient and more focused on legal positioning than on actually building the frickin' railroad in the first place. As a result of this, the cost overruns on the initial construction segments were staggering. The original budget for the first 119-mile segment from Madeira to Bakersfield was approximately $6.4 billion. But by 2018, that figure had risen to over $10 billion. By the early 2020s, it had climbed even further. Now, of course, we will talk about why that actually happened, but before it is, we need to go and rewind time back a little bit because we skipped through quite a number of several very important years where everything changed once again because of an election. In this case, the rail supporter Obama was out because President Trump had been elected in 2016 for his first term, and things were going to change rapidly. The election of Donald Trump in 2016 would create a new and very hostile political environment for the project at the federal level. The Trump administration was openly skeptical of high-speed rail and particularly critical of California's project, which Trump and other officials would frequently mock as, and I quote, a boondoggle, end quote. In 2017, the administration would announce that it was considering clawing back federal funds that had been awarded but not yet spent. This created a crisis for the CHSRA, which was counting on that money to continue construction. In 2019, the federal government would take formal action, announcing that it would cancel $929 million in federal funding and seek to recover an additional $2.5 billion that had already been obligated. The stated reason was that California had failed to make sufficient progress on the project and had not met the conditions of the grant agreements. Now, the Trump administration's actions were widely seen as politically motivated, a punishment for California's opposition to Trump's immigration and environmental policies, which, yeah, that more than likely is a part of it, because for anyone who is aware, Trump is somehow, if you're not aware, a very petty person. That much is obvious, but even if it was petty, it was simultaneously legally grounded in the fact that the project was indeed way behind schedule. It had missed many of its milestones, and a lot of its promises that it had made had not been kept. So it is then that the CHSRA in the state of California would fight back, filing lawsuits to block the federal government's actions. This legal battle created uncertainty that made it difficult to continue construction work, as contractors and suppliers were wary of working on a project whose funding was in jeopardy. This particular situation was not resolved until after the 2020 election and the rise of Joe Biden as president, but even then, there was still going to be a lot of problems as costs just kept rising and rising and then rising some more all the way through the late 2010s and into the 2020s. Now, when I'm talking about this, the reason for the cost increases were multiple, and each one would compound with the other, and it would just make each one worse. Land acquisition costs would exceed projections, utility relocations on acquired land, this being moving water lines, gas pipelines, electrical infrastructure, telecommunications cables, etc. All that proved to be far more complex and arduous than had ever been anticipated. And then, of course, there was the issues with contractors that I mentioned here previously. In fact, among the ones that I just listed here now, the utility relocation problem alone really deserves an extended examination because it exemplifies the kind of cascading failure that plagued the whole project. When you build a railroad through an area that has been inhabited and farmed for over a century, you are building through a landscape that is crisscrossed with all kinds of stuff. Underground and above ground infrastructure that was installed by dozens of different entities over many different decades. In the Central Valley, as an example of this, that meant Pacific gas and electric power lines and gas pipelines, local irrigation, district water canals, buried water mains, AT&T and other telecommunications cables, county drainage systems, municipal sewer lines, agricultural irrigation systems that were the lifeblood of the whole region's farming economy, all of this stuff. Every one of these utilities that crossed the rail corridor had to be identified. They had to be mapped. It had to be assessed and either relocated or protected in the place that it was. The authority had assumed in its initial planning that utility relocations would be relatively straightforward and inexpensive. That, as you can probably guess from the theme of this video so far, that proved to be catastrophically wrong. The first problem was that, and I kid you not, nobody actually really knew where all the utilities were. Utility maps in the Central Valley were oftentimes decades old. They were incomplete or just inaccurate in general. Utilities that had been installed in the 1950s or 1960s sometimes had no records at all. They had been buried by work crews that had long since retired or just died, and no accurate as-built drawings existed. When construction crews began excavating, they would frequently encounter utilities that were not on any map, in locations that they were not expected. Each such discovery would trigger a work stoppage, while the utility had to be identified, its owner contacted, and a plan being developed on how to deal with it. Now, sometimes the utility owner was a major corporation like PG&E that had its own bureaucratic process for authorizing work on its own infrastructure. Sometimes it was a small local irrigation district with limited staff and resources. Sometimes the ownership of the utility was disputed or unclear. They didn't know who it actually belonged to. In one particular case that really shows how bad all this was, construction crews had discovered an abandoned petroleum pipeline that nobody had known about, which triggered an environmental assessment requirement that delayed work for literally months by itself. The second problem was that even when utilities were identified in advance, the process of relocating them was way more complex and expensive than anticipated. Relocating a major PG&E gas transmission line, for example, was not simply a matter of digging it up and putting it somewhere else. It required extensive engineering design, environmental review, permitting from multiple agencies, coordination with PG&E's own construction schedules and safety requirements, and often the construction of temporary systems to maintain service while the permanent relocation was underway. Each major utility relocation was essentially its own mini construction project, with its own design phase, its own permitting phase, its own construction phase, and the authority had to negotiate agreements with each utility owner specifying who would do the work, who would pay for it, and what standards the relocated utility would meet. It was a nightmare, and these negotiations were often contentious. What I mean by that is there were many cases of utility companies seeing the high-end rail project as an opportunity to upgrade their own aging infrastructure at the authority's expense, demanding new replacements for systems that were decades old. Now, the authority pushed back, arguing that it should only be responsible for replacing utilities to their existing condition, not upgrading them, and these disputes oftentimes added months and sometimes years to the relocation timelines. It really sucked. The third problem was that utility relocations had to be completed before the main railroad construction could proceed in a given area. This created sequential dependency that made schedule delays cascade through the entire project. If a PG&E gas line relocation in one area was delayed by 6 months due to a permit issue or something like that, the railroad contractor could not begin foundation work in that area for 6 months, which meant that the viaduct construction in that area was delayed by 6 months, which meant that the track installation in that area was delayed, and so on and so forth down the line. Because the construction was supposed to proceed in a coordinated sequence along the entire corridor, a delay in one area oftentimes had ripple effects that affected work miles away. The authority had not adequately planned for any of these sequential dependencies, and it didn't have the project management systems in place to track and manage them effectively. It was, again, a giant mess. As a result of this, the cost of utility relocations ultimately ran into the billions of dollars, far exceeding the original estimates that the authority had. Internal authority documents that were later obtained by journalists and oversight agencies would show that some utility relocation packages came in at 3 to 5 times their original budget amounts. The authority's own inspector general repeatedly would flag utility relocation costs as a major driver of overall cost overruns, but the authority seemed unable to get the problem under control. Part of the issue was that the authority had no actual real leverage over the utility companies. It needed their cooperation to proceed with construction, but the utility companies had very little incentive to move quickly or keep costs down because, after all, they're not the ones paying for the work. The result was a dysfunctional dynamic in which the authority was at the mercy of entities whose interests were not aligned with the project's success. It was a fustercluck. Beyond utility relocations, the construction itself would encounter problems that reflected the broader challenges of building large infrastructure in the United States. Environmental compliance was a constant source of delay and cost. Despite the fact that the project had undergone extensive environmental review and had received its federal environmental clearances, construction activities would trigger additional environmental requirements on an ongoing basis. When grading work would disturb soil in areas that had been identified as potential habitats for endangered species, like the San Joaquin kit fox or the blunt-nosed leopard lizard, construction had to stop while biologists would conduct surveys and mitigation measures were implemented. When construction activities encountered cultural resources like artifacts from Native American habitation or early European settlement, work had to stop while archaeologists would assess the finds and determine whether they required preservation or documentation. Each of these stoppages was individually justifiable on environmental or cultural grounds, but collectively they would each add months to the construction timeline and millions of dollars to the costs. If anything, the thing that I'm reminded of this here is there's an example of when I was actually traveling for a group trip that I had done in Rome, where there is a subway system in Rome that just gets stopped every couple months because every time they're digging, they keep hitting an archaeological site. And that just makes sense in the city of Rome. Either way, besides the actual stoppages on the ground, the authority would also struggle with the management of its own internal operations and its relations with the veritable constellation of different consultants and contractors and advisors, etc., that were doing most of the actual work. The CHSRA was, by the standards of agencies managing megaprojects, remarkably small and understaffed. At times, during peak of construction activity, the authority had fewer than 200 full-time employees overseeing a project that was employing, quite literally, thousands of construction workers and generating billions of dollars in contracts. This small staff was supplemented by a large number of outside consultants, many of whom were employed by the same firms that were doing the construction or had financial relationships with the contractors. The authority's program management consultant was WSP, as I mentioned earlier, a global engineering firm that was paid hundreds of millions of dollars to help manage the project. The rail delivery partner was initially Parsons Brinkerhoff, which later merged with WSP. If you didn't catch that, don't worry, the critics definitely did. They would point out that this arrangement created an inherent conflict of interest. The firms that were being paid to oversee the project had financial incentives to see the project continue and grow rather than flag problems that might lead to cutback or cancellations or move faster. They were literally incentivized to keep things going as long as possible. The authority's board of directors, which was appointed by the governor and legislature, was composed primarily of political appointees rather than people who had deep experience in rail construction or megaproject management. Board meetings would frequently focus on political messaging and public relations rather than on detailed technical and financial oversight that a project of this complexity required. The board would receive information from the authority's staff and consultants that was oftentimes filtered through layers of optimistic interpretation, we will say, making it difficult for board members to actually understand the true state of the project. When problems were identified, they were oftentimes presented as temporary setbacks that could be overcome with simply additional funding or schedule adjustments, rather than symptoms of a deeper systematic dysfunction. Along with this, the revolving door of leadership at the authority would compound these management issues. The position of CEO or executive director of the CHSRA would turn over repeatedly, with each new leader bringing a different management style, different priorities, and different relationships with the contractors and consultants. Jeff Morales, who served as CEO from 2012 to 2018, would oversee the period of initial construction and the early cost escalations. He was succeeded by Brian Kelly, the former Secretary of California State Transportation Agency, who took over at a time when the project was already in deep crisis. Each leadership transition meant a period of learning and adjustment during which institutional momentum was lost and contractors could exploit the disruption to advance their own interests. The lack of continuity at the top was mirrored by high turnover at lower levels of the organization, as staff members would burn out from the stress of managing such a massive project that was constantly in crisis or left for better paying positions in the private sector. It was, to use the term again, a fustercluck. The financial trajectory of the project during this period was deeply alarming. The authority was required by law to produce a business plan every 2 years, and each successive business plan told a worse story than the last. The 2012 business plan, as I noted here earlier, had estimated the total project cost at approximately $68 billion, which, again, was already more than double the Proposition 1A figure. The 2014 business plan held the estimate roughly steady through what arguably you could call creative accounting and optimistic assumptions. But by the 2016 plan, the costs were climbing again. The 2018 business plan would then estimate costs at being $77 billion, but even that figure was arrived at through a series of assumptions that many independent analysts considered unrealistic, including projections of future construction cost inflation, keeping it lower rather than letting it run higher, as we would see happen over the course of COVID in the early 2020s. The reliance on future federal funding was even more speculative. The business plans would consistently include large amounts of federal money that had never actually been appropriated, authorized, or even proposed in the first place. The authority would project that the federal government would provide tens of billions of dollars for this project based on general assumptions about federal infrastructure spending trends, without any specific legislative basis for these projections. This was not merely optimism. This was a planning methodology that allowed the authority to present a balanced financial picture to the public while knowing that the money to actually complete the project physically did not exist. Independent analysts, including the state's own legislative analyst office, would repeatedly point out that the funding gap between what the project would cost and what had actually been committed was enormous. Like, we're talking about something at the time in the 2010s of like $50 billion or more, and that there was no realistic plan or even anything close to it to acquire said money. Private investment, which had been a key selling point to Proposition 1A, was conspicuously absent on the project's financial reality. The proposition had been sold to voters partly on the promise that private investors were going to contribute significantly to the construction cost, as had happened with some international high-speed rail projects. But no private investor had shown any serious interest in putting money into California's project, which, considering everything we've been talking about here, is for pretty good reason. Private investors in infrastructure projects usually expect a reasonable return on their investment, typically generated by fair revenue or government payments. The California project's ridership projections were highly uncertain. The cost was spiraling out of control. Its completion date was receding into the indefinite future, and its political environment was increasingly hostile. No rational private investor is going to look at this and go, yeah, hey, I'm going to put billions of dollars into this project that may not even happen or ever get complete. It's a bit of an issue. The authority would occasionally announce partnerships or expressions of interest from various entities, but none of these ever really materialized into actual financial commitments. The private investment component of the funding plan was effectively a fiction that was maintained in business plans to make the overall financial picture look less dire than it actually was. On that note, the thing that I mentioned here earlier was ridership fare. The authority's ridership projections were another area where optimistic assumptions were simply masking uncomfortable realities. The business plans projected that the completed system would carry anywhere between 25 to 40 million passengers per year, generating from that billions of dollars in annual fare revenue. Now, these projections were based on complex modeling that took into account population growth, travel patterns, gasoline prices, airfare, other factors like that. But the models are highly sensitive to the input data that you put into it. Like, it's one of those things almost like an Excel sheet. You change one little number and that could change everything that you see for a formula. And so critics would oftentimes argue that the authority would consistently choose assumptions that inflated ridership estimates. For example, the models assumed significant population growth in the Central Valley, partly driven by the assumption that, oh, well, if you have a high-speed rail there, that would make it possible for people to live in places like Fresno or Bakersfield, and then they could commute to jobs in the Bay Area or Los Angeles. This was effectively a circular argument. On paper, if you first look at it, it kind of makes sense, but again, it's a circular argument. The project's ridership projections would depend on land use changes that would only occur if the project was built. And then it would only work if it was successful. The models also assumed relatively high gasoline prices and relatively high airfares, which made rail travel look more competitive by comparison. When independent analysts went and ran the models with different assumptions or closer to reality averages, they oftentimes produced ridership figures that were a fraction of the authority's projections. Which is not good. It's definitely not good. This was really not painting a good picture heading into 2019, which, mind you, again, 1 year before the entire project had been projected to be completed in the first place, and again, not a single piece of track had been laid at this point. It is into this picture that the current governor of California at the time that I am making this video in 2026 comes into play, Gavin Newsom. When Gavin Newsom succeeded Jerry Brown as governor in 2019, he inherited the high-speed rail project at one of its lowest points. Costs were soaring, the federal funding was in jeopardy, and public support was at an all-time low. In his first State of the State address in February of 2019, Newsom would deliver what many interpreted as a death blow to the project. Arguably, the whole thing could have been over right there, when he said, and I quote, "Let's be real, the current project, as planned, would cost too much and take too long. There's been too little oversight and not enough transparency," end quote. He announced that he would scale back the project to focus on completing the Central Valley segment and abandon, for the time being, the ambitious vision of a statewide system. And that did not go over well. Newsom's comments would send shockwaves through the political landscape of California, with supporters of the project feeling betrayed and opponents declaring victory. The national media would report that California was abandoning its high-speed rail dreams, but within days, Newsom began to walk back his comments. He clarified that he was not canceling the project, but rather believed that being realistic about what could be achieved was better. He reaffirmed his commitment to completing the Central Valley segment and said that the state would continue to seek funding and partnerships to eventually extend the system to the major population centers. But the problem was out in the open now. This episode demonstrated the project's political toxicity, as even a Democratic governor in a deeply Democratic state felt compelled to distance himself from the project, only to then have to retreat under the pressure from the project's supporters. Still, there would be a little bit of a windfall. The Biden administration's election in 2020 would bring a more favorable federal environment. The administration would restore the $929 million that Trump administration had tried to cancel, and it provided additional funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law passed in 2021. This cash infusion was to help build a station in Fresno and acquire trains for testing, which was good. Yes, it was good. But even with said windfall, California remained at least $7 billion short of what it needed for the first short run through the valley. The project remained dependent on state bond funds and California's cap and trade revenue system, which were insufficient to bridge the enormous funding gap that was gradually getting wider and wider and wider. To explain that, the cap and trade revenue system probably deserves a little bit of scrutiny on its own, because that became one of the primary funding mechanisms for the project, and it really showcases the precariousness of the entire financial structure of the project itself. What I mean is that California's cap and trade program requires companies that emit greenhouse gases to purchase allowances at quarterly auctions administered by the California Air Resources Board. A portion of the revenue from these auctions is then directed to the high-speed rail project under the legislation passed in 2014 at Governor Jerry Brown's urging. The amount of money generated by the cap and trade auctions varies depending upon a number of factors, like the price of carbon allowances, which in turn depends on market conditions, the stringency of the emissions cap, and the overall health of California's economy. In pretty good years, the auction can generate over $1 billion, which is awesome, of which the high-speed rail would receive around 25%. In bad years, though, the auction revenue drops sharply. The authority's business plan would project cap and trade revenue streams decades into the future, assuming that the program would continue to exist, that auction prices would remain stable or even increase, and that the high-speed rail project share would not be reduced. However, everything that I'm describing here was merely a bunch of speculative assumptions about political decisions that had not been made yet by legislators that technically here had not even been elected yet in the first place. Literally, anything could change, they were just assuming the best. And again, you can see where there might be a little bit of a problem. By the year 2022, the project's Central Valley construction was revealing the full scope of the challenges that had been predicted by critics for years. The 119-mile segment under active construction was being plagued by problems on multiple fronts. The construction contractors, primarily the teams led by Tutor Perini and the Spanish firm Dragados, were billing at rates far behind projections, meaning the work was taking much longer than planned. At the billing rates observed in 2022, analysts estimated that it would take roughly 4 more years to complete the remaining work, pushing completion to approximately 2026, years behind the original schedule. Now, the problems were not primarily with the physical act of construction itself, but with the prerequisites that needed to be in place before construction could proceed that I mentioned here earlier. Land acquisition remained incomplete despite years of eminent domain proceedings and negotiations, and utility relocations were catastrophically behind schedule, and people were getting more frustrated. As an example of this, Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon would publicly declare in the spring of 2022 that, quote, "there is no confidence in the project," end quote. A remarkable statement from one of the most powerful Democrats in the state, and a signal that even the project's political allies were losing patience. In August of 2022, the authority would approve the design contracts for the remaining 52 miles of the initial operating segment that would connect Madeira to Merced in the north and Shafter to Bakersfield in the south, with construction contracts expected in the 2025 to 2026 timeframe. In October of 2022, the authority would approve a design contract for the stations at Merced, Fresno, and Bakersfield, which is at least something, and these approvals represented forward progress in the planning process. But it also really underscored just how far the project still was from completion. The authority was still in the design phase for significant portions of a line that voters had been told would be fully operational in its entirety literally years earlier by this point. The governor and the legislature were locked in dispute over the project's future direction and funding, with legislators demanding more accountability and transparency before approving additional spending, and the governor would push to maintain momentum. But there was no real momentum. The year 2023 would bring about increasingly urgent warnings from the construction contractors themselves. Dragados, the Spanish firm leading construction package 2 through 3, sent a letter warning of further delays extending to at least 2025 due to ongoing land conveyance issues, parcels of land that the authority had not yet acquired or cleared for construction. This was a remarkable situation. The authority had hired contractors to build a railroad, but years into the construction contracts, it still had not delivered all of the land on which the railroad was supposed to be built in the first place. The contractors were essentially being asked to build a structure on property that the authority did not yet have full control of, leading to work stoppages, out-of-sequence construction, and a cascade of change orders and claims that had become the defining financial feature of the entire project, with each change order meaning more and more and more costs. By December of 2023, the authority had acquired 2,000 258 out of 2,295 required parcels on the 119 miles under active construction. That is 98% of all land. Which, okay, that does sound pretty impressive as a percentage. But the remaining 37 parcels were disproportionately problematic, oftentimes involving more complex legal situations, the most contested valuations, or the most difficult physical relocations. Moreover, even on parcels that had been acquired, the land was not always ready for construction due to, again, the need to relocate existing structures, remediate environmental contamination, or complete other on-site preparatory work. The outstanding utility relocations that I spoke about here earlier, those were emerging as an even more serious bottleneck than land acquisition. On Construction Package 1, 18% of utility relocations had not yet even been started, and the figure was 20% for Construction Package 2 through 3. Both construction packages had scheduled completion dates at the end of 2026, but given the pace of utility work, meeting those deadlines appeared to be nigh on impossible. And that brings us to 2024. By February of 2024, the authority reported that construction packages 1 through 3 were more than 70% complete, and construction package 4 was at 98%. These numbers represent genuine physical progress, which is good. Bridges were being built, viaducts were taking shape, earthworks were being graded, and the skeleton of a railroad was becoming visible across the Central Valley landscape. But the progress metrics only slightly hid continuing problems with costs and schedules. As an example of another problem that I haven't even mentioned here before yet, the authority was also supposed to have selected a train set vendor by December of 2024. This being the company that would actually manufacture the high-speed trains that would run on the tracks. This was a critical milestone because the design of the trains affected the design of the tracks. That affected the stations, that affected the electrical systems, that affected the signaling infrastructure. Everything that would be determined by the train. According to the Federal Railroad Administration's later compliance report, the authority missed this milestone entirely. And we'll explain that more here later. But still, the overall project cost would continue its relentless upward march. What had once been an estimated $33 billion when voters approved it in 2008 was now estimated at more than $100 billion for the full San Francisco to Los Angeles system, with only the 171-mile segment connecting Merced and Bakersfield planned for completion by 2033. The Central Valley segment alone, which was originally supposed to be the cheapest and easiest part of the entire system, was now an estimated $30 to $33 billion. Which, yes, as I had just said here from that number before, that is the cost that the entire project was supposed to be back at the start of everything. And it's just for the cheapest, easiest segment. And this, my friends, is what brings us to the last year of 2025, heading into 2026. This being when all the problems that we have been describing became ammunition for yet another dispute with the federal government, because now, once again, President Trump was back in office. What I mean by this is that with Donald Trump back in the White House for his second term, the Federal Railroad Administration, or FRA, would issue a notice of intent to terminate more than $4 billion in federal grants to the California High-Speed Rail Authority. The FRA would cite persistent delays, financial shortfalls, and failure to comply with some terms of the funding agreements. Now, this was not merely a political gesture. This was a formal administrative action that, if carried through, would remove a massive portion of the project's funding and potentially trigger cascading financial consequences. The Federal Railroad Administration's compliance report, which formed the basis for the threatened grant termination, was absolutely devastating as a document that cataloged in extreme detail every single way for the past 15 years that the California High-Speed Rail Authority had failed to meet the terms of the federal funding agreement. These were not vague policy disagreements. This was not something that was merely retaliation for political matters. This was specific, measurable failures tied to contractual obligations that the authority had voluntarily accepted when it took federal money and then failed to meet. The most prominent failure was the train set vendor selection. Under the terms of its federal grant agreements, the authority had committed to selecting a manufacturer for the actual high-speed trains by December of 2024. This was not an arbitrary deadline. This was a milestone that the authority had itself proposed, recognizing that the choice of the train technology would have cascading effects on virtually every other aspect of the system's design. The type of train selected would determine the specifications for the electrical system, the signaling and the train control system, the track geometry, the station platform heights, the configurations, the maintenance facilities, the dozens of other technical parameters that are necessary to actually have a functioning rail system. Delaying the train set selection meant that all of these downstream design decisions were also delayed, or had to proceed on the basis of assumptions that might end up being incorrect once a vendor was actually chosen. The authority had initiated a train set procurement process, but had encountered complications that reflected both the project's unique challenges and also the broader difficulties of the international high-speed rail market. The global market for high-speed train sets is dominated by a small number of manufacturers, primarily Alstom of France, Siemens of Germany, Hitachi of Japan, and a handful of Chinese or Korean firms. Each of these manufacturers produce trains that are designed for particular technical standards and operating environments. European trains are designed for European track gauges, electrical systems, and signaling standards. Japanese trains are designed for the Shinkansen system's unique specifications. Adapting any of these existing designs for the California system, which uses a combination of American, European, and custom technical standards, would require significant engineering work and would essentially produce a Frankenstein train that had no other market. Like, literally, this train could not be sold anywhere. It would literally just be meant for California. Not even the United States, California. That, of course, made the California contract less attractive to manufacturers than it might otherwise have been. The volumes were relatively small by global standards, the technical requirements were more unique, the project's completion timeline was uncertain, and the political environment created risks that the whole contract might be modified or canceled before delivery ever occurred. It was risky, and no one really wanted to do it. The procurement process was further complicated by Buy America requirements that mandated that a significant percentage of the train components had to be manufactured in the United States. These requirements were politically popular, yes, but technically challenging because the United States, unlike in the case of automobiles or freight trains, has no existing high-speed rail manufacturing base. Any manufacturer that won the contract would have to go and establish new manufacturing facilities in the US or partner with a domestic firm, adding costs and complexity. The authority reportedly received proposals from multiple manufacturers, but found all of them unsatisfactory for one reason or the other, whether it was too expensive, technically non-compliant, or requiring schedule commitments that the authority just couldn't make given the uncertainty of its own timelines and issues. So, rather than selecting a vendor that did not meet its requirements, the authority chose to restart the procurement process, which meant missing the December 2024 deadline by a huge margin. From that, the FRA's compliance report would also document financial deterioration that went way beyond the headline cost increases. The report would examine the authority's cash flow projections and found that the timing of expenditures and revenue did not align. The authority was burning through its available funds faster than new funding was being committed, which created a risk that construction would eventually have to stop at some point before the Central Valley segment was ever complete, simply because the money ran out. The cap and trade revenue that had become the project's primary ongoing funding source was not coming in at the rates the authority had projected, partly because carbon allowance prices had fluctuated, and partly because the legislature had faced increasing pressure to redirect cap and trade funds to other priorities, including wildfire prevention, affordable housing, direct climate adaptation measures, etc. Each budget cycle would bring a fight over the high-speed rail project's share of cap and trade revenue, and while the project had so far retained its allocation, there was no actual guarantee that this would continue indefinitely. The report would further note that the authority had not secured the funding needed to complete even the Merced to Bakersfield segment, let alone the full system. The authority's own estimates showed a funding gap of several $1 billion for the Central Valley segment, and the gap for the full system remained in the range of somewhere like $70 to $80 billion. The authority's plan to close these gaps relied on future federal grants, continued cap and trade revenue, and hypothetical private investment. the same categories of speculative funding that had been criticized in every previous business plan. The FRA concluded that the authority was not on a credible path to completing the project, and that continued federal investment was not justified without fundamental changes to the project's management, financing, and governance. And so, as a result, federal funding was ordered to be pulled in the summer of 2025, and California panicked. Governor Newsom, who had been the one to publicly acknowledge the project's problems in his 2019 State of the State address, now found himself in a position where he had to vigorously defend the project against what he characterized as politically motivated attacks by the Trump administration. Now, this was not entirely inconsistent. Newsom had never called for canceling the project, only for being more realistic about the timeline, as I said before, and he viewed the federal funding threat as a different issue entirely from the project's internal management challenges. In Newsom's framing, the Trump administration was punishing California for its political opposition to the president, using the high-speed rail project as a weapon in a broader campaign of retribution against blue states that had challenged his policies on immigration, climate change, and other issues. The state's legal strategy centered on several arguments. First, California argued that much of the federal money at issue had already been spent or legally obligated. It had been used to pay for construction work that was already complete, land that had already been acquired, and contracts that had already been executed. Clawing back money that had already been spent would not only be unprecedented and legally questionable, but also essentially that would be requiring California to return funds for services that had already been rendered. Second, the state would argue that the FRA's compliance findings were pretextual, that the authority's failures to meet certain milestones did not justify the termination of the entire grant, because federal infrastructure grants routinely experience delays and modifications without triggering termination. Third, California would argue the grants agreements contained dispute resolution procedures that the FRA was required to follow before taking unilateral action, and that the FRA had not properly exhausted these procedures before yonking the money. The authority would file legal challenges in federal court, and the case quickly became one of the highest profile confrontations between California and the Trump administration in a period that was already characterized by intense federal-state conflict. California's Attorney General, who already had filed dozens of lawsuits against the Trump administration on other issues, would add the high-speed rail funding dispute to his portfolio of legal battles that included challenges to federal immigration enforcement, environmental rollbacks, and funding conditions imposed on sanctuary cities. The most immediate practical question following the termination was whether or not construction would continue, though. The authority had approximately 119 miles of active construction underway in the Central Valley, with thousands of workers employed across various multiple construction sites. The construction was being funded through a combination of federal grants, state bond proceeds, and cap-and-trade revenue, and the loss of federal funding did not immediately halt construction then, because the authority had other funding sources that could sustain them, at least in the near term. But it did create a medium-term funding cliff that threatened to force construction shutdown if the legal challenges were not resolved or alternative funding was not secured. Still though, the authority made a deliberate decision to continue construction at full pace in the months following the termination, partly to demonstrate the project was still viable and progressing, and partly to maintain the skilled workforce that would be difficult to reassemble if construction stopped. And also, at the same time, to create facts on the ground that could strengthen California's legal and political position in court, where they were, hopefully for them, fighting the battle with the Trump administration. Stopping construction would have been interpreted as an admission that the project could not survive without federal funding, which would have undermined the state's arguments in court and in the court of public opinion. The authority would then accelerate certain construction activities, prioritizing work that would complete visible structures and create the impression of momentum. But the financial reality behind this decision is that the whole thing was very precarious. The authority was drawing down its remaining bond funds and cap-and-trade reserves at a rate that was not sustainable over the long term. Internal financial projections showed that without either restored federal funding or a major new state funding commitment, the authorities would exhaust all of its available construction funds within approximately 18 to 24 months, meaning sometime in 2027, at which point active construction, no matter what is going on, would have to stop regardless of the legal situation. But really, who knows what will happen at that point? We will get there when we get there, I guess. And likely, this video will suddenly become far more relevant in 2027. So if you're watching this at that time or beyond, hello there. This is again probably the longest video I have ever made and is a comprehensive history of the entire project and its scandals up to this point in early 2026. But now we have to look at the current political situation and the potential massive fallout that has been building in the background. The federal funding termination would force a reckoning within the California Democratic Party that had been building for years, but it had been papered over by the shared desire to oppose the Trump administration. Essentially, this has been a policy for many Democratic lawmakers for years, is that it did not matter what it is that they did, as long as it is that they opposed Trump. With the federal money now formally cut off and the legal battle uncertain, Democrats in the legislature could no longer avoid the fundamental question that they had been kicking the can down the road of for years. Should the state commit tens of billions of additional state dollars to continue the project, or should it cut its losses? Because again, as a result, the party would effectively fracture into four roughly identifiable camps, each with its own logic and potential base. First up, you have the true believers. These being legislators who remain genuinely committed to the full vision of the high-speed rail connecting San Francisco to Los Angeles. This group includes many representatives from the Central Valley, where construction was providing tens of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in economic activity to communities that had historically been among the poorest in California. For Central Valley legislators, the high-speed rail project was not an abstraction. It was the single largest economic development initiative that their districts had ever seen, and they were not going to give that up. Construction workers, concrete suppliers, steel fabricators, trucking companies, restaurants, hotels, countless other businesses were dependent on the project's continued spending. These legislators argued that abandoning the project now would devastate their communities while wasting the billions that had already been invested. These were joined by legislators with strong ties to the building trade unions, who remained the project's most powerful organized constituency and who made clear through their lobbyists and campaign contribution patterns that continued support for the project was a prerequisite for union endorsement and financial support in future elections, which for any politician is vital. The true believers would also include legislators who saw high-speed rail as essential to California's climate commitments. California has adopted some of the most aggressive greenhouse gas reduction targets in the world, and its transportation sector remained the largest source of emissions in the state. Supporters argued that high-speed rail was one of the few strategies that could meaningfully reduce emissions from inner-city travel by providing an alternative to driving and flying between Northern and Southern California. They pointed to the experience of other countries where high-speed rail had dramatically reduced domestic air travel. In Japan, France, and Spain, the introduction of high-speed rail on major corridors had shifted the majority of travelers from planes to trains, with corresponding reduction in carbon emissions. Abandoning that project, they argued, would be an admission that California was not serious about climate change, undermining the state's credibility on the international stage and in federal climate negotiations. After them, you have the more pragmatic supporters, these being legislators who believed the project should continue, but who wanted significant reforms before committing additional state funds. This group would acknowledge that the project had been poorly managed, that costs had spiraled out of control, and that the authorities' leadership had repeatedly failed to be honest with the legislature and the public about the project's problems. They did not want to kill the project, but they wanted conditions attached to any new funding. Conditions like independent oversight boards with real enforcement power, mandatory cost containment benchmarks that would trigger automatic funding freezes if they were exceeded, leadership changes at the authority level, and a revised project scope that honestly acknowledged what could actually be built with available resources rather than continuing to promise a system that could not afford to be funded in the first place. Some pragmatic supporters would advocate for breaking the authority's monopoly on the project delivery by bringing in an experienced international rail operator or construction firm to take over management of the project. They would point to the example of Crossrail in London, where the project had been rescued from its own management failures by bringing in new leadership with a mandate to stabilize costs and schedules. Others proposed converting the authority from an independent state agency into a division of Caltrans or another existing agency on the theory that the authority's independence had allowed it to operate without adequate accountability. Still, others would propose creating a public-private partnership structure that would shift some of the financial risk to private investors. Though, again, as we mentioned here earlier, project's track record made it difficult to really imagine what kind of private investor would actually volunteer to take on that risk, but you know, to each their own. After this, though, you get the quiet skeptics. These were the legislators who had privately concluded that the project was a failure, but who were unwilling to say so publicly because of the political costs. These legislators represented districts where the project was not really a major employment source, and where their constituents were increasingly becoming frustrated by what they saw as a colossal waste of taxpayer money. They heard from constituents who wanted the state's limited resources spent on housing, healthcare, education, wildfire prevention, water infrastructure, homelessness, or any other number of other pressing priorities that have been rocking California that, again, we could easily do a video on rather than, just on a railroad to nowhere in the Central Valley. But these legislators also knew that publicly opposing the project would put them on the wrong side of the building trade unions, which remained formidable players in Democratic primary elections. A Democratic legislator who voted against high-speed rail funding could expect to face a union-backed primary challenger at the next election, funded by construction unions that viewed the project as an existential priority. This dynamic kept many skeptics in line. They could express concerns in private conversations and closed-door caucus meetings, but would ultimately vote for continued funding when the roll was called. After this, though, you have the open opponents. This being a very small but growing group of Democrats who have concluded that political calculations have shifted enough to make opposition viable. They were typically legislators from safe districts where unions' ability to mount a credible primary challenge was limited, or legislators who were term limited and no longer worried about future elections. They argued publicly that the project should be wound down in orderly fashion, that the Central Valley construction should be completed to create a usable conventional rail corridor that could provide some transportation benefit, even without high-speed trains, and that the remaining bond funds and cap-and-trade revenue should instead be redirected. Some proposed using the money for urban transit expansion in Los Angeles and the Bay Area, where the dollars would benefit far more riders. Others proposed investing in the state's crumbling highway infrastructure or in zero-emission vehicle charging networks that could reduce transportation emissions without the multi-decade timeline and massive cost seen of high-speed rail. And then, of course, besides them, you have the other side of the political aisle, the Republicans. California's Republican legislative minority, which holds roughly a quarter of the seats in both chambers, was almost unanimously opposed to the project and had been for years. Republicans viewed the project as a symbol of everything that was wrong with Democratic governance in California. Wasteful spending, grandiose promises, bureaucratic incompetence, and the prioritization of ideological goals over practical results. The federal funding termination gave Republicans their strongest argument yet. Even the federal government, which had provided some of the project's earliest and most critical funding, had concluded that the project was not viable. Republicans would demand a full accounting of all money spent on the project, called for criminal investigations into what they characterized as fraud and mismanagement, and introduced legislation to redirect remaining bond funds to highway and water infrastructure. But, as you can expect from what I just described, the Republican position was politically comfortable for them, yes, but practically irrelevant, like it literally didn't matter. Republicans have almost no power whatsoever in California, and they do not have the votes to stop anything. What made the political situation genuinely dangerous for the project was that the Republican arguments were increasingly resonating with the public and with the quiet skeptics within the Democratic caucus. So it is here then, my friends, into this picture that we have to finally look at Governor Gavin Newsom, who has found himself in perhaps his most difficult political position of his entire career. Governor Newsom's relationship with the high-speed rail project has been defined by contradiction after contradiction from the very beginning of his governorship. His 2019 State of the State address, in which he appeared to abandon the full San Francisco to Los Angeles vision in favor of just a Central Valley-only segment, would alienate the project's most passionate supporters without winning over any critics. He spent the subsequent years trying to walk that statement back, insisting that he remained committed to the full system while simultaneously emphasizing the need for realism about timelines and costs. This straddling posture had worked well enough when the project was grinding along in relative obscurity, but the moment the federal funding termination thrust it into the center of national attention, this would force Newsom to take a clear position. The problem was that every clear position available carried devastating political costs. If he went and championed the project aggressively, committing to the massive new state funding package to replace the lost federal dollars, he would be putting tens of billions of dollars of the state on a project that the state's own legislative analyst, the federal government, and a growing chorus of independent experts had concluded was not viable at all. If the project continued to underperform, which virtually every credible analysis suggested that it would, Newsom would own that failure personally. It was his, just like in the case of Brown. The political attack ads practically write themselves, with footage of half-built overpasses in the Central Valley running cost tallies, comparisons between what the money could have brought in with regards to housing or schools or wildfire prevention, homelessness, something else, versus what it had actually produced. For a politician who still harbors ambitions beyond California, and Newsom seems to have been discussed as a potential presidential candidate since his first term, being permanently associated with what critics were already calling the biggest public works failure in American history was a potential career-ending liability. That would be a major problem. On the other hand, if he goes and abandons the project, acknowledging that the federal funding loss made the full system unviable and proposing an orderly wind-down, he would face the full fury of the building trade unions and the progressive wing of his party. The building trades had been among Newsom's most reliable political allies, providing campaign funds, organizational support, and the kind of blue-collar credibility that was increasingly valuable to a Democratic Party worried about losing working-class voters. Betraying the unions on their highest priority project would not just cost Newsom their support, it would actively create powerful enemies who would work against him in whatever he did next. The progressive wing would frame abandonment as capitulation to Trump, an admission that a Republican president could kill a Democratic state's signature initiative through sheer political pressure, something that he had fought against for literally years. In the context of the broader California resistance to the Trump administration, which had become central to the identity of California Democrats, surrendering on high-speed rail would be seen as an act of political cowardice. Besides that, if he tried to split the difference, continuing construction in the Central Valley while deferring any commitment on the extension to San Francisco and Los Angeles, he would satisfy no one. This was essentially what he had proposed in 2019, and the intervening 6 years had demonstrated that a Central Valley-only line was politically unsustainable because, again, it delivers no real benefit to the population centers where the vast majority of Californians actually lived. A train running from Merced to Bakersfield, no matter how fast, served a population of roughly 1 million people in a state of 40 million. Without connections to the Bay Area and Los Angeles, the line would be used primarily by Central Valley residents traveling between small and medium-sized cities. A useful regional service, sure, but nothing that could actually justify the tens of billions of dollars that was invested. Voters in Los Angeles and the Bay Area, who collectively represent more than 2/3 of the state's entire population and an even larger share of its tax base, would increasingly ask, why are we paying for a railroad that would likely never have us ride it? And so now, here we are. At the time that I'm recording this, in late February of 2026, a couple of things have happened. The first is that after nearly 2 decades, track is finally starting to be laid, and this began literally this month a couple of weeks ago. The second is that in light of how much public scrutiny or attention from bad actors the rail is getting, legislation has been proposed to restrict information on it from being made public. Mind you, again, this is a proposed bill, not actually something that is up for vote right now, as I said at the beginning of this video, but per Lori Wilson, a Democrat who chairs the Assembly Transportation Committee, lawmakers are, quote, not trying to hide anything, and that, quote, we want maximum transparency and maximum accountability for this project, end quote. The purpose of this bill, according to her, is to solely keep sensitive information out of the hands of bad faith actors, and that other state agencies are already governed by similar restrictions. But Republicans aren't convinced. State Senator Tony Strickland would say that as long as high-speed rail continues to use taxpayer dollars, any information on the project should not be withheld from the public, saying, and I quote, it's our money. You're talking about one project more expensive than the entire state budget was just 10 years ago, end quote. He would say that, quote, California does not have a revenue problem, it has a wasteful spending problem, and it has an accountability and transparency problem. This bill lacks accountability and transparency and takes it in the other direction, end quote. From this criticism, Wilson would say that she plans to make changes to the bill to clarify its intent. AB 1608 is expected to come up for its first policy hearing in the coming weeks, but we'll see what actually happens with that. And that, my friends, is where we will wrap things up with a note about what the future may bring. California actually dropped its lawsuit against the federal government over the withheld billions of dollars in federal funds in December of 2025, and not many people realize this. With California Attorney General Rob Banta's office filing a notice voluntarily dismissing the case without prejudice. Whatever the logic is behind that decision, we don't really know, but the practical effect is still the same as if they had lost in court. Billions of dollars that the authority had counted on are gone, and there is no active legal mechanism to recover them. It is with this context that the authority faces a statutory deadline of March 2nd, 2026, just in a couple of weeks now at the time I'm filming this, to release its draft 2026 business plan. That document will be the first business plan produced since the authority's 2024 business plan, which existed when federal funding was still a thing and there was a more friendly federal government that was in charge. That is no longer the case at all, and 2026 will have to deal with the consequences. In the meanwhile, the authority has made a 2025 supplemental project update report that has offered several possibilities for the project's future. The largest idea, which is the one supported by the authority's CEO, Ian Choudhury, is a Gilroy to Palmdale spine estimated at $87 billion that would provide San Francisco to Los Angeles connectivity through Caltrain in the north and Metrolink in the south, hoping for operations to launch by early 2038. Now, it may sound like something may finally be happening when I say that, but critics have noted that this plan may not legally be compliant with the terms of Proposition 1A, since trains terminating at Gilroy, rather than operating over dedicated high-speed track all the way to San Francisco, would likely push travel times above the 2-hour 40-minute limit that had been promised by the initial ballot measure. And guess what? We are still not over with the potential issues here, because now there is also some personal drama that we have to address here with the CEO, because that happened literally this month as well. CEO Ian Choudhury was arrested on February 4th at his home in Folsom on suspicion of misdemeanor domestic battery. His fiancée, Ludmila Starostuk, was arrested on suspicion of the same offense and also on suspicion of cruel or inhumane corporal punishment of a child. Apparently, Choudhury's daughter, who police dispatch records indicate had called 911 to report that Starostuk had pulled her hair and pushed her. The Sacramento County District Attorney's Office would decline to file charges against either individual, citing an inability to establish a dominant aggressor, but Choudhury would subsequently take voluntary leave of absence, with Chief of Staff Mark Tollefson assuming day-to-day responsibilities. Now, you may be looking at me and then wondering, okay, Stack, why? Why the hell would you focus on personal drama now of all times? That doesn't seem to be relevant to the story at all, and normally you would be right, but here you are wrong, because there is a potential corruption or at least conflict of interest angle with all this. You see, Starostuk, his wife, as it turns out, is an advisory manager at KPMG, which holds a $24 million financial advisory contract with the California Rail Authority. The couple's attorney would maintain that her role at KPMG is unrelated to the Rail Authority's contract, but the authority did not immediately respond to questions about whether her position posed a conflict of interest under agency policy. Now, whether or not that defense is correct is besides the point, considering all the other issues that the rail has had, but it is just another potential example of mismanagement or perhaps fraud we can't really say yet and probably won't know for potentially years or even decades. As it is now, my friends, though, California's high-speed rail project has spent more than $18 billion already in public funds, over more than a decade of construction, and only just now this month was track finally starting to be laid, literally decades behind schedule. The project was sold to voters in 2008 as a roughly $33 billion system connecting San Francisco to Los Angeles by 2020. That did not happen, and now it has since grown into a monster that officials now estimate could cost more than $120 to $130 billion, literally 4 times the price of what it initially was, with even the scaled-back Gilroy to Palmdale version being priced at $87 billion and full connectivity not arriving until 2038 at the earliest. Mind you, with everything that we've been describing here before, it's likely going to be pushed back again. The authority has already admitted that the Merced to Bakersfield segment would not be profitable, even once operational, meaning California would be perpetually subsidizing the line in the agricultural Central Valley that serves no major urban center and fulfills none of the original promises made to voters. The result is a project that has now consumed billions of dollars with very little to show for it, that has shattered public trust in the government's ability to deliver large infrastructure projects, and that has become a national symbol of government incompetence. It is a scandal, not in the sense of simple corruption like we've covered with a number of other countries and projects, though yes, there have been allegations of waste in management and the issue we mentioned here before with the CEO's wife, but rather this is a scandal in a deeper sense. This has become to many people a systematic failure of American politics and institutions to build the kind of infrastructure that other developed countries take for granted as their norm. Whether or not it will ever be complete, we can't really say, but billions of dollars more will likely be spent before anything is figured out. Of that, I'm pretty sure we can be certain. At this point, I am exhausted, my friends. This is the end of the video. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all here next time. This has been the greatest undertaking that perhaps I have ever launched on this channel, so any help with that would be greatly appreciated. My back literally hurts from sitting in this position this entire time, partially hunched over. All right. Thank you. I will see you all here next time, and goodbye, my friends.